When Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the other pioneers of women's rights began to lobby for women's rights in the late 1840s, Truth was ready to join their fight. At first, many of the abolitionists worked with the women's rights groups. When the nationwide debate over the abolition of slavery grew more heated, some supporters of the women's rights movement began to call for a separation of the two groups. They feared that their association with the abolitionists would imperil their crusade for women's rights. For although the issue of whether women were entitled to the same rights as men was certainly controversial, the practice of slavery was a topic that sometimes provoked dramatic and often deadly action. Pioneer of women's rights. When some of these separatists saw Truth at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, they became determined not to let her speak. During the midday break, several of them gathered around Gage and asked her to prevent Truth from addressing the convention later that afternoon. "It will ruin us," said one man, who claimed that the newspapers would then describe the conventioneers as a bunch of abolitionist agitators. Gage refused to make any promises. "We shall see when the time comes," was all she would say. Yet Truth did not rise to speak during the afternoon session. She sat in the shadow of the pulpit steps and remained silent. During the morning of the convention's second day, she again appeared to be content merely to listen to the speakers, most of whom were men, for few people in the 19th century thought that it was proper for a woman to give an address in public. Among those who spoke were several clergymen. The first minister who stood before the conventioneers told them that men were entitled to superior rights and privileges because they possessed superior intelligence when compared with women. The next minister defended the domination of women by men on the grounds that Jesus Christ had been a man. If God had desired the equality of women, the minister said, He would have given some token of His will through the birth, life, and death of the Savior. One minister said that women had a lower status than men because of the original sin committed by Eve in the Garden of Eden. Another minister explained that the inherent inferiority of women was proven by their need to have men hold doors open for them. He said that women did not deserve the same rights as men because they were so much weaker. All of these ministers believed that their sermons championing the superiority of men had dispelled the audience's enthusiasm for women's rights. In fact, the views of these ministers had proven to be extremely upsetting to many of the women in the audience. Yet none of the women seemed prepared to argue in public with such well-respected clergymen. Then Truth arose and walked up to the lectern. "Don't let her speak," cried a half-dozen men sitting near Gage. Truth removed her sunbonnet, and then she turned toward Gage, seeking permission to speak freely. Gage hesitated for a moment, then stood and introduced Truth to the audience. "Well, children," Truth began in a low, soft voice. She was determined to rebut the ministers who had used Jesus and the Bible to argue against women's rights. Even though she could not read, she knew every word printed in the Bible, and she was certain that none of them said that women were less than men any more than they said that blacks should be slaves. "Where there is so much racket," Truth continued, "there must be something out of kilter. That something," she added, "was the domination of women and blacks by white men. The supporters of this unequal order will be in a fix pretty soon," she said, thanks to the efforts of abolitionists and feminists. Truth then turned to the minister who had said that women were too weak to deserve equal rights. "How could that be?" she asked. Nobody had ever helped her into a carriage or ever carried her over a mud puddle or even given her the best place anywhere. She paused for effect and pulled herself upright so that her tall frame was even more imposing than usual. Then, in a loud voice which sounded to some in the audience like rolling thunder, Truth said, "And aren't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm." She rolled up a sleeve of her dress all the way to the shoulder and held out her arm. It was not a plump arm, the kind that most women saw in their mirrors each morning when they got dressed. Her arm, after many years of hard labor, was lean and sinewy. "I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me," Truth said. "And aren't I a woman?" She declared that she had worked as hard as any man and that she could eat as much as any man, too, although many times she had gone hungry. She had borne children only to watch them